But I mean, you want to? I mean, talk about it. I think you should remind everybody all the time of Eric Garner. I mean, you want to talk about that case?
Yeah, I mean, it was a crazy case. I spent 2.5 years of my life researching it. The real essence of it was, I mean, the most surprising fact that I learned was really early on, which was that Eric Garner wasn't even selling untaxed cigarettes that day. So if you go back and look
at the core story of that narrative's wrong.
Yeah, it's completely wrong. And it was a classic example of what happens in the internet age when we try to do news stories that are viral, right? So an error gets out on the internet, on Twitter, and it just gets repeated often enough that it just becomes part of the story before anybody can catch up to it. And so even today, if you go back and look at the news stories about what happened, what you'll get is some version that says Eric Garner was involved in a altercation while resisting arrest for selling untaxed cigarettes. Actually, the story was a lot weirder and more disturbing than that. Garner, of course, did sell untaxed cigarettes for a living. That's what he did. Right. And he did it every day of his life, and he had been repeatedly busted for it. But on that particular day, first of all, he'd had an argument the night before because he had turned somebody in or called the cops on somebody, and so people in the neighborhood were upset about that. There was a dispute over whether that was snitching or not.
Right.
So he came in and he was sort of trying to clear that up with some people in the neighborhood, like, no, it wasn't, like this, that, and the other thing happened. Then he got sick, and he went and he spent like 2 hours in the bathroom in basically a welfare office across the street. Came out, broke up a fight, because that was one of the things that he did there. He was a big guy, and they wanted to keep cops out of the neighborhood, and fights were bad for the neighborhood. So a fight broke out. He breaks it up. He's winded. He leans up against the wall, and then these two cops come over, and they're like, "You're coming with us," and that's the genesis of this story. And the back story there is that some lieutenant drove by the neighborhood earlier that day, saw Garner standing on the corner, and had probably gotten an earful at the Comstat meetings. You know what those are? Like, you ever watch The Wire?
Yeah.
Yeah, so they still have those. These are these things where, like, the senior police officers get shown pictures of their neighborhoods, and the higher-ranking guys, like, yell at you, like, look at all these fucking people on the streets. Can you clear that up?
Yeah.
So Garner was a very conspicuous guy. Somebody had gotten an earful about Garner. They drive by the neighborhood. They see him on the corner, and they tell these two meathead detectives who are sitting around the precinct, "Hey, go pick him up." And so that's how this whole thing got started. It didn't even have any, like, selling untaxed cigarettes isn't even a misdemeanor.
Right.
Right? It's a ticket. But he wasn't even doing that. He was literally just leaning up against the wall. And there's so much in that's wrong and bizarre, starting with the whole statistical imperative. Like, that's why all this stuff happens. That's why we have so many more of these incidents that are necessary. But it was just a classically terrible, avoidable situation.
There was this piece that I read that came out a little bit after Garner. I forget who wrote it, but there was also a case in Louisiana where a guy was killed by cops. And in that case, he was selling,
I think it was
like
CDs,
DVDs or something like that out of his trunk. And the frame of the piece, it was called, I remember the title, it was called "Knocking the Hustle" because of the Jay-Z song.
Uh-huh.
And it was just like a contrast of, like, essentially what these guys are doing is they're doing like poor and urban versions of like Airbnb style disruptions.
Right.
Like, they're looking for little micro areas in an economy where there's an open lane, and
it's an arbitrage.
They're doing arbitrage, right? And then in this case, and then of course, instead of getting honored for innovation, they're killed.
Right, exactly.
But like,
exactly,
it's literally the same thing, just in a different racial and economic context, which explains all of it.
Garner basically did the same thing for a living that Ivan Boesky did. He just did it on a smaller scale. I mean,
and probably broke up more fights and helped more people.
right.
Yeah, let's
exactly.
be real. Yeah. It was like an altogether better human being in every way, shape, and form.
Yeah, I mean, he had his foibles, but but at this point in his life, he had really chilled out a lot. He was much more of a family man. In his youth, he sold crack, and he was a bit of a hustler, but he didn't really have the heart for it. Like that was one of the consistent details that I got from people on the street, was that Garner really, he started off in the drug dealing business, and it just never really had the gumption to stick with it. He took days off. Like that was one of the things.
He took days off. I like that.
Yeah, like I had
that.
one person tell me, like, Eric, man, like he took days off.
He wasn't a go-getter.
Like holidays, like on Halloween, he would like spend it with his family.
Yeah.
And guys would be like, you can't turn your pager off, dude. And and so that's who he was. He was kind of in it for the money. He got in trouble. He had gotten a very bad fight when he was younger and went to prison for that. And then he just had consistently awful luck, and the cops, because he was so big and so conspicuous, they just constantly picked on him.
And none of those stories need to be dependent. Like, what I also really hate is it's just like, that illustrates it too, right? Like, somebody doesn't have to be a saint and wronged. Like, you can be basically the same sort of mediocre bag that basically we all are.
Right.
But you're in a context where that means you're involved with more shit by definition.
Right.
And none of these, it was, I mean, that was Giuliani's whole tactic, right? It was like the NYPD just murdered an innocent person. Well, what's the guy's case file?
Right.
It's
Exactly.
Totally irrelevant. And by the way, it'd even be irrelevant if we actually discovered that somebody was like a real dirtbag.
Right.
Like an actually genuinely bad person. It's irrelevant.
Yeah.
They got caught up in something. It's all it has, totally secondary.
Yeah. No, that's the first thing they do is they go searching through the file, and and they have favorite reporters that they call up, and they say, this is what happened during the interrogations in previous sessions. Like, Ramsey Orta, who's the guy who filmed the Garner incident. He got this more than Garner did. Garner had a really clean rep on the street. He was considered a really nice guy. All the store owners liked him. But the guy who filmed the episode, Ramsey Orta, had a worse rep, and the cops were completely blamed the whole thing on him, even though it could have been Mary Poppins sitting there that day. You know what I mean? It had nothing to do with anything that he was the guy with the camera that day. But they were constantly calling reporters and talking about what happened with him, and they went out of their way to build cases on him. They had a sting involving him. I mean, it was, and he's in jail now. He's the only person in that whole tableau who's now currently in jail. And it was, I would say that it was.
So the guy who exposed what I would call a murder, I don't know any other word to say it. I mean, I'll editorialize that. The guy who literally filmed and made it available. I mean, I remember that case was so blatant. Just the visual, like setting aside everything else, like the propaganda of certain people, your important reporting, the visual of that. George W. Bush, if I remember correctly, saw that and was like, yeah, it looked pretty bad. And the only one who goes to jail is the guy who showed that.
Exactly. Yeah, no, it was amazing. And the thing about Ramsey going to jail, and I got to know him pretty well, and he look, Ramsey was a drug dealer. He had some issues. He was a little bit of a scary dude on the street. He doesn't even shy away from that. That's like who he was. But the police, when they finally brought him in, one of the first things they said to him was they took a picture of him as he was getting arrested, and they were like, "You took a picture. Now we're taking the picture," right? Like, like it's a one-to-one thing, and they just never were able to get to the place where they understood what had happened and were not able to blame it on somebody else.
The only other thing I want to touch on, which is also, I mean, I feel like maybe it's somewhat inspiring because what she did while she was here was amazing, but maybe just talk about his daughter.
Oh, Erica.
Yeah,
that was so sad. I mean, I got to know Erica pretty early in the process. I had gone out there a few times to talk to people about who Eric Garner was, and he just seemed like a really interesting person to me. And I thought, well, maybe I'll write a book about this, but I can't really do it without the family. So I called her up, and we met. And I said, if I'm going to do this, I'm not going to be able to just sort of depict him as a saint. I'm going to have to say whatever I learn.
Right.
And she's like, I don't want that. Like I want people to know exactly who he was. I don't
Because he was a real person.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
And she actually insisted on it that way. She's like, if I find out that you're leaving things out, I'm going to be upset. And then, when I met her was just when she was sort of starting to be kind of an activist, and it was sort of thrust upon her because, the Sharpton family Sharpton was talking for the family originally, and she kind of became disillusioned with that whole situation and started feeling like she had to do all the talking herself, and she started leading these protests. And she turned out to be really good at it. I mean, like some people.
Yeah, she was really talented.
Yeah,
very articulate, charismatic person. Yeah.
She was able to command a crowd. She felt like the responsibility very keenly, and went after it. Didn't turn people away. She took brave stands on things, like the whole business about supporting Sanders was. She got a lot of flack for that, but that was just her sitting and thinking, like, on her own. And it was the thing about her dying was just so horrible and unexpected. So it's that was a really sad story.
Yeah.